Good morning, everybody. This is Charles Lee with the University of Newcastle, Australia, based in Singapore. Welcome to the New Tech World Congress 2020. I'm very happy to be here to present as a keynote speaker for the International Conference of Environmental Pollution and Remediation, ICEPR 2020. Thank you for the organizers for me as a keynote speaker. I'm going to speak on ecological restoration of degraded peatlands in Indonesia, achieving the United Nations Sustainable Development Goals. As you know, in peatland forests is a unique wetland ecosystems. It's partially decomposed organic matter that accumulates over thousands of years under waterlogged conditions to form carbon-rich soils called peat, P-E-A-T. So it's critical for preserving global diversity. It provides safe drinking water, minimize flood risk, and help address climate change. It's a natural terrestrial carbon store, more than 3 million kilometers square, traps, sequesters 0.37 gigatons of carbon dioxide per year. So it stores more carbon than any other vegetation types. So if the peatlands are damaged or destroyed, as we will discuss later, major sources of greenhouse gas emissions are released, and almost 6% of global anthropogenic CO2 emissions per year. So if we look at this particular figure here, you will see that let me go back one step, okay, that the conversion of the peatland forest releases large volumes of carbon from the below ground. So for a typical upland forest, as you see in Brazil, the soil underneath only contributes about a few hundred tons of carbon per hectare, whereas for peat forests, because of the deep peatlands to a few meters, 10, 20 to 50 meters deep, it has stored at least 10 times more carbon per hectare of peatlands. So when it's destroyed, as we see in Southeast Asia, there's extensive degradation from natural and anthropogenic factors like wildfires, as you have heard, as well as deforestation. So results in severe environmental, socio-economic impacts on a local and global scale. So land, peatlands, degradation, and restoration negatively impacts at least 2/5 of humanity. That's according to the IPBES report. That's the United Nations Intergovernmental Science Policy Platform on Biodiversity and Ecosystem Services, and is responsible for biodiversity loss and intensifying climate change, contributing to mass human migration and increased conflict. Okay. So in terms of relationship with the UN SDGs, we find that the peatland restoration, in other words, restoration and rehabilitation of land, is very important, right? Because they provides ecosystem services, biodiversity, as we mentioned earlier, community development, and wetland crops. So the impact of land restoration and rehabilitation has actually impact not on only a few, but all 17 SDGs. As you see in this report, the source is the UN Environmental Program that just came out last year on land restoration for achieving sustainable development goals, right? So the UN SDG, as you know, was conceptualized in 2015, and it's scheduled to be completed to meet all the goals by 2030, which is only 15 years away. So right now it's only 10 years away. We have had 5 years of embarking on this UN SDGs. So land restoration and rehabilitation impacts all 17 SDGs. So you can read that in the report. We'll pick up a few SDGs later to focus on. So peatland restoration, the benefits as we see in this figure is recovery of ecosystem functioning, provision of food, improving of air and water quality, climate regulation, pest and pathogen regulation, enhanced crop pollination, and buffering storm damage. As we can see in the we're in this COVID-19 period, with massive destruction of forests, actually is possibly causing some of the these viruses to impact humans, right? Impact animals and then impacting humans. So there's a reduced risk of infectious diseases and pests, when we restore peatlands, greater supply of food and clean air, and all kinds of benefits to human health also, right? And we see here, this slide is not very good, but I borrowed it from the UN report. It basically focuses on the degradation and restoration impacts on 5 specific SDGs. So they are related to hunger. SDG 1 is no poverty, 2 is hunger, 3 is good health and well-being, 4 is quality education, 6, SDG 6 is clean water and sanitation. So how do we see the impacts? We can see then that the red ones are the degradation. Red colored is the impacts from the land in terms of destroying it, right? Impacting. So we are, the burning the forest, cutting down, deforestation, and not managing the land properly. So the red ones you see are damaging, whereas the green one is when the land is damaged, degraded, we are restoring it, and how it impacts the 5 SDGs. So if we see here, I will show land degradation, it reduces water infiltration. So you can see then for water, it when the land is has problems with water in terms of the irrigation and the permeability and so on and so forth, it reduces the productivity of the land, so which you have less fertile, so we have less income then and less food, which impacts SDG 1 and 2. Similarly, with lower water quality, it impacted the soil and the rivers, adjacent creeks and lakes. From the land quality destruction, it will impact the clean water and sanitation, right? The water quality is degraded and destroyed, so it will impact SDG 6. So for the green parts, you can see when we restore the land, the increased water infiltration, it basically brings back the productivity of the land, more income, more food, and so it's reversed. So the reverse effect will impact the same SDGs, the 5 that we talk about, right? 1, 2, 3, 4, and 6. So that's what it's trying to depict here. So very logically, for land, which relates to land, restoration and rehabilitation, it impacts life on land, which is SDG 15. So it's very specifically is SDG 15, which we can relate to, which defines as protect, restore, and promote sustainable use of terrestrial ecosystems, sustainably manage forests, combat desertification, and halt and reverse land degradation and halt biodiversity loss. Okay, so there are 9 specific targets on the life on land, and you can see 15, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9. You can read it yourself. For example, as we have discussed earlier, conserve and restore terrestrial and freshwater ecosystems, end deforestation and restore degraded forests. That's 15-2. The targets to end desertification and restore degraded land. 15-4 deals with conservation of mountain ecosystems. And then 15-5 has ABC, basically is protect biodiversity and natural habitats, right? Biodiversity, the biodiverse world of the flora and fauna, not just animals, but also the plants to be protected, right, in related to life on land, including genetic resources, poaching, and prevent invasive alien species from coming in, and integrate ecosystem in governmental planning that deals with governance, which is very important. So moving on then, we see for specifically in the Indonesian archipelago, where we are coming back to the region that I reside in Southeast Asia, we can see there are huge peatland resources, as much as 15.4 million hectares across various provinces. As you know, in Indonesia, is the land of many islands. Some are very large islands, like Borneo is one of the 7th largest island in the world, and Sumatra and Java. So it crosses from Indian Ocean, South China Sea, Timor Sea to the Pacific Ocean. So these are the areas that has rich peatlands that is naturally occurring. So very important to conserve them. Unfortunately, as you have heard about the peatland fires from deforestation and massive burning of the peatlands. So we find that it has a smoldering problem, which has created massive haze across the different ASEAN region. So what happens in the peatlands? They are drained for agriculture, especially plantations like oil palm, acacia for pulp and paper, and other plantations. Now they're drained, so the peatlands, as we can see, are wet, and they are, very, very precious land and soil and forest. So when they're drained, it becomes dry, so it becomes a risk for fire. So we're actually putting in non-wetland, non-peatland kind of crops like oil palm and rubber, for example. So the land is dry, and the forest is already cut down. So when you have a drought and dry season, or even the sparks of fire from burning, it burns not only above ground, but below ground, because it is dry. And the peat is like organic matter that is very easily burnt, and you have massive fires above and below ground. So in the 2015, in the Transboundary Haze, we see peatland fires in Sumatra and Borneo, the 2 major islands, have caused clouds of toxic haze encompassing ASEAN countries, in particular Singapore that I live in, and Malaysia. And so in 2016, to tackle this problem, massive amounts of peatland has been burnt. And to restore them, and also to prevent further fires, the President Joko Widodo instituted a national peatland restoration agency, right? BRG, Badan Restorasi Gambut, which is in Bahasa, to tackle this problem. Basically, the approach is, we call it 3 R's: re-wetting, revegetation, and revitalization. So what are they? So re-wetting, basically, because the peatland is drained, it is dry. So we need to restore the drained peatland to its natural state, right? Peatland is very wet, almost like a wetlands, and it's underwater, very high water tables. So because it is drained to put crops for agriculture, we need to re-wet them by doing all kinds of canal blockings. Basically, they have to drain the land, they have put in canals, dug in canals that are a few kilometers, and pump the water out from the peatlands until the groundwater is lowered. So we need to raise up the groundwater, so the canals have to be blocked by different methods, box dams, compacted peat dams, as well as infilling. So we'll see some of these pictures and examples later on in the presentation. Revegetation, the forests are burnt and replaced with economic crops like oil palm, and we need to revegetate them to something that is back to peatland forest. So establish a vegetation cover over the peatland to raise humidity, lower temperatures, and decrease the fire risk. So peat swamps, species of economic value. So we want the villagers community to survive. So we also have the cash crops like sago, jalotong, and galam. So there are at least 80 species of economic importance. So they might not be naturally in the peat swamp, but you need the communities to survive on some cash crop. So sago, for example, which we'll see later, is a crop that provides sago flour that is of high value for the villagers to thrive as well as sell as an income generator. And they're also naturally occurring in peatland areas. So they will grow in wetted kind of soils, in peatland soils, okay, rather than in drained areas. So then the second part, we also need the natural system to come back. So predominantly maybe 60–80% of the land we want to put in the natural swamp species, the peatland forest type, to grow and repopulate the area. And palidiculture is where we are planting natural swamp forests using native plant species as well as some cash crops, all right, to revegetate that degraded peatlands. So revitalization basically is to regenerate the destroyed peatlands from fire, as well as the drained peatlands back to something natural. And using some practical examples, again, re-wetting, revegetation, so that the community will survive on some sort of commercial crop that survives without drainage, like sago, and also with the rehabilitated peatland forest, because it is probably not practical to take it back to some natural peatlands because the communities need to survive. So you need some hybrid system where you have some cash crops that actually grow on natural peatlands, as well as they bring in the natural peatland forest species to revegetate the area. So this example is in the project in Sungai Tohor. Is in Sumatra. As you can see, the island of Sumatra, which is not very far. This place, Tebentingi Island, which is not far from Singapore, just a ferry ride of 2 to 3 hours. We reached there. Our project is in this community. It's been, a lot of the areas has been destroyed by fire because of the concession that was given to a plantation group, and draining the area, it has subjected the area to fires. So the area is massively destroyed by fires, and we are trying to restore that land back to something natural. That's what we call a peatland restoration in the Sungai Tohor area. So the objective is to restore the damaged Sungai Tohor peatland, and not an easy task. It will take many years. So we're looking at an experimental site of 3 hectares. And the objectives is to obviously involve the community. Definitely first, to look at the background, how they can, come back to use the land sustainably over the long term. And one way would be revegetation of natural peatland forest species, replanting, as well as putting in sago as a cash crop, and re-wetting the land from raising the groundwater and blocking the canals so that the water will not flow out further away from the peatlands, okay, and raise the groundwater. So that's our objectives of the study. We'll look at some pictures. So the baseline vegetation study is where the question is, what kind of peatland forest species are we going to bring into this degraded peatlands in Sungai Tohor? So in an adjacent swamp forest, we took a survey of the background vegetation. So it's a square quadrant of 20 by 20 meters. we measured the diameter at breast height, which is the diameter of the tree trunk, and surveyed that area to see what kind of species of peatland forests are there in terms of abundance, richness. So if you're familiar with the vegetation study, we're looking at the importance value index. It measures the overall significance of a species, and the parameters are density, frequency, and dominance. So we did that, and we are able to get then at least about 34 species. We can see the local names, the scientific name, the family, the numbers that we found. And from there, we took at least 13 species out of that 34 selectively that are hopefully fast growing. Also some commercial crops, as we mentioned, to provide some income, sustainable kind of living income for the communities to return back to the area. So sago is very important, as I mentioned, which is naturally grown there. Coffee and raman and resa are timber-related kind of trees, right? So these are the commercial crops actually are naturally growing on the peatlands, on wet soils, so they do not have to be drained, so they should be sustainable, okay? So these are some examples on the pictures of the revegetation and taking, you know, the seedlings. We had a nursery to grow them for a couple of months before we can transplant them to the experimental site. Planting trees in a particular location involving the community, especially the youth that was involved. Then looking for sago seeds in that area that we can plant. That's the cash crop that we are planting as part of the revegetation effort. So sago, in a nutshell, in one slide, we see that the sago palm is a very ubiquitous crop in peatlands, and it produces a good product. So the sago logs are chopped and then is cut. And we have a starch slurry centrifuge. So the rejects can be used, which are the coarse fibers and the starch. Some of the rejects can be used as feedstocks for animals and the livestock industries. The good starch is extracted, as we can see later, washed and filtered, and we have, and then the wet flour that it needs to be dried, and we have sago flour. It's like tapioca flour or like wheat flour. So it's very, very useful to make, as we see here, breads, pancakes, biscuits, yeah, like any flour product. So very valuable, good income for the villagers. You can mix with boiling water, force through a sieve under high pressure to form sago pearls. As you can see, some of you probably like pearl drinks, and it can be used to make desserts, right? And the pearl teas also. Sago powder is used widely in the thickening agent in foods. So we need to promote it more so that they can sell the sago to be exported. For this case, a lot of it is the flowers is actually the wet sago is exported to a Malaysian entity to be dried and packaged and sold in the market. So coming to re-wetting, there are different types of canal blocking. As earlier was discussed, the canals are not natural. They are dug on the, many kilometers in the peatland by the plantation group or concessions that are draining the peatlands for agriculture. So the canals are dug. Obviously the water comes up naturally because you have high water table and the water is pumped out. And that's how the water table drops. That's how the peatland is drained. Now we need to reverse that. So we need to block the canal. So in blocking the canal, the water is not going out to further out to the sea or being pumped out. And so the water would, reverse and be blocked. And hopefully then the groundwater will be raised. So the different kinds of canal blocking or particular box dams are made from wooden boxes filled by sandbags or peat, created by the local community labor. So the cost about $5,000 each. Takes weeks to build, not that stable, but that's can be readily put in. So I did one of this not work of learning this box dam in Malaysia a few years ago, and to see how they block the canals to restore the water table. Another one is you can see the open canal on the left picture. It's just like a creek or river, very scary, right? Kilometers of this canal that is man-made to drain the peatland. So we need to block this. So this is an example on the right slide of canals being blocked. And this infilling is basically you filling it up with the peat or soil to block it. And partial infilling, and then because the water is not flowing, and over time the vegetation regrows over it, you don't have quite the canal anymore, and hopefully then the water is then returned back to the natural state, which raises the groundwater. So these groundwater monitoring wells, we need to monitor the groundwater to see that it's not dropping further, but through canal blocking, it is being raised so that it will further re-wet the soil up to a much higher level, that will return the peatland to some natural state, right? The higher the water table to some natural level will be good. So we are putting monitoring wells in specific locations to measure the groundwater levels over time. So this is just some data that we have. To wrap up then, the long-term plans, that's just the initial stage. We are starting to replant and monitoring the success of the revegetation. It takes time, it takes years. We have just about in the first year of the study on extending it to more experimental sites. So the short term, 5 years, is to use Sungai Tohor as a model community, and hopefully over 10 years influence other communities in the region. There are many in the Tebing Tinggi Island, to restore the peatlands, that we can scale up this model across the island and much long-term sustainably to extend to other Indonesian areas. So this very much is a community-based effort rather than working independently. We're working with the local communities, the scientists locally, as well as practitioners with expertise from a nonprofit in Singapore, which is the PM Haze, People's Movement to Stop the Haze. And I'm with University of Newcastle, providing some expertise and funding for this project. With that, that's the end of my presentation. There's a lot of information available on the peatlands, as you can read, and there's a huge amount of interest in Indonesia on restoration of peatlands. There's webinars that just happened today, and UNEP, United Nations Environmental Program, that has some projects in Kalimantan, Borneo, that has some case studies. So we hope to write some papers out of this and further develop this project down the road. Thank you very much. I'd like to acknowledge the university that I belong to for a very small research grant for this work. PM Haze, the nonprofit based in Singapore, the executive director, Benjamin Tay, and our intern from the university, Yuki Yokoyama, and of course on the ground, the Sungai Tohor Peatland restoration team. Thank you very much.